I'm Professor Van Norden, and this is Neo-Confucianism and Chinese Buddhism. And today we're going to be looking at Huayan Buddhism, which to my mind is one of the most fascinating movements in philosophy in general, and certainly in Buddhism and in Chinese Buddhism. And it has an immense influence on how Buddhism develops, not just in China, but throughout East Asia. And it also has a huge influence on how Neo-Confucianism, which we're going to study later, which is a reaction against Chinese Buddhism. Ironically, Neo-Confucianism, although it's anti-Buddhist, absorbs a lot from Huayan Buddhism. So here's a quick overview of where I'm going to be going in the lecture. I'm going to start out by giving you an overview of how we get from Nāgasena's version of Buddhism, which uses the chariot simile to explain why Buddhists think there is no self, through Nāgārjuna's formulation of Chinese Buddhism, which takes that a step further. And then when this Buddhism gets to China, we get Huayan, which is a distinctive form, which says some things that I think no Indian Buddhist would have said. Then later in the lecture, we'll talk about Fazang's Rafter Dialogue, this fascinating but also challenging Chinese philosophical work. And then if we have time, we'll go on to look at Fazang's essay on the Golden Lion. If we don't get to the essay on the Golden Lion in this lecture, we'll get to it in the next lecture. So let's start out talking a bit about a little overview. So Nāgasena, whom we looked at in an earlier lecture, he lived around the 2nd century BCE. And one of the claims he makes, as you'll recall, is that everything that exists, every dharma, everything that exists is just an instance of one of the 5 skandhas. So there's 5 kinds of material or mental states that exist, and the temporary transient configurations of mental or physical states, those are called a dharma. And so all that exists, according to Nāgasena, are these dharma. So for example, there might be the mental state of seeing a banana. And this might stimulate a memory, a recollection of tasting a banana. And the recollection of tasting a banana in the presence of the banana then leads to a desire to have a banana. But at the same time, you might have another experience of seeing a banana. And that experience of seeing a banana might lead to remembering having an allergic reaction to bananas. And then this might lead to a desire to avoid eating bananas. And Nāgasena is going to say these mental states and corresponding physical states, like the temporary a subatomic state of the banana at an instant in time, those are real, but those are all that's real. For convenience sake, we group together certain mental and physical states, and we call that John maybe. And then another series of physical and mental states, we group those together by linguistic convention. The dotted line just indicates fairly arbitrary linguistic convention, and we call this other somewhat arbitrary grouping of physical and mental states as Jane. But there's not a thing in the universe John, which is distinct from a thing in the universe Jane. They're just conventions we have about how we group together some of the physical and mental states in the world. And so the self, for which we compete with others and fight against others and try to possess things permanently, is an illusion. And the other selves that we're fighting against are an illusion. And the things that we're competing for, if we perceive them as something other than just transient configurations of mental and physical states, those are also just illusions, those selves. And so this is what Nāgasena thinks of as the significance of the doctrine of no self, that all that exists are dharmas, transient configurations of the 5 skandhas, the 5 kinds of mental and physical states. And he uses the chariot argument, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, to explain why he thinks that's true. Now, also within India, you get this later development which is a form of Mahayana Buddhism called Madhyamaka. And one of the greatest philosophers of the Madhyamaka Mahayana tradition is this guy Nāgārjuna, who probably died in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And Nāgārjuna takes the argument that Nāgasena and a Buddhist like him gives, but he says it doesn't go far enough. Because Nāgārjuna admits, he says, well, yes, composite entities like what we call Van Norden, or what we call Vassar College, or what we call New York State. New York State, Vassar College, Van Norden, those are not independently existing things in the world. These are just composite entities which are empty in the sense that they are empty of a permanent independent self. So he agrees with, Nāgārjuna agrees with Nāgasena that composite entities are empty because they're dependent on transient configurations of material and mental states. He says that, as far as that goes, that's right. But philosophers like Nāgārjuna make a very good point, I have to admit, against earlier philosophers like Nāgasena, because they say, well, but these transient configurations of material and mental states, these dharma, that Nāgasena and philosophers like him take to be the ultimate constituents of reality. Because philosophers like Nāgasena say, yeah, those transient configurations of physical and mental states, they are transient, but they have an identity of their own. They're real. They're, to use our favorite metaphor from the Course, it's not turtles all the way down. According to earlier philosophers like Nāgasena, the bottom turtle, so to speak, is sitting on these dharma, these transient but real configurations of physical and mental states. But then Nāgasena says, well, but each transient configuration of material or mental states is dependent on other configurations of material or mental states. The only reason you get the desire to eat the banana is that there was the dharma of the remembrance of eating a banana and it tasting good. And the only reason you're having that memory is that there's a previous state of seeing a banana. And so each of these dharma, and the same thing's true for physical states. Physical states are caused by earlier physical states. So by parity of argument, in a parallel argument, if the composite isn't real because it's dependent on these transient physical and mental states, then the transient physical and mental states are not fully real, or at least they're empty of a permanent independent self, because they're dependent on other physical and mental states. Therefore, everything is empty. It's emptiness all the way down. Everything lacks a permanent independent self. And this is one of those great dividing points in metaphysics, the study of what are the most fundamental kinds of things that exist and how are those things related to each other. Because some people have a very strong sense that, look, it can't be turtles all the way down. There has to be something which is real, which even if it's transient, at least it's real and everything else is constructed out of that. Whereas there are a handful of other philosophers like Nāgārjuna who say, the arguments you've given for Van Norden and a Chariot, or Van Norden's Toyota Prius, or New York State or Vassar College not being empty are equally good arguments for those transient physical and mental states also being empty. So it's emptiness all the way down. And it's a really powerful and profound philosophical position. But then when Buddhism gets to China, it goes a step further and ends up saying that because of the kinds of arguments that Nāgārjuna gives, all is one and one is all. And this is the slogan of Huayan Buddhism, a distinctively Chinese kind of Buddhism: all is one and one is all. Now, why might you think that? Well, just as an example, let an empty circle here represent a dharma, right? An aspect of reality. And let this particular empty circle here represent me, Van Norden, right? So suppose you want to understand Van Norden. Why is Van Norden here? And what is the identity of Van Norden? Well, in order to understand me, you need to take into account my parents. right? My father and my mother, because obviously I'm not here causally without my father and my mother. Also, I'm not here conceptually. If you want to know who Van Norden is, one of the things Van Norden is Van Norden's the child, the son of Charles and Helen Van Norden. But of course, if you want to understand Charles Van Norden, you need to make reference to his mother and father, my paternal grandparents. But if you want to understand my mother, causally and conceptually, she's dependent on her parents, my maternal grandparents. But then let's not leave out some of the other things that I'm dependent on. I'm dependent on the sun, because if the sun weren't heating the earth, I would not be alive now, and life in general would not be possible on the earth. But of course, I'm dependent not just on the sun, I'm also dependent on the earth, because without the Earth's gravitational field, I wouldn't be here. And without the Earth's gravitational field holding down the atmosphere, I wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't be able to hear my words without an atmosphere. So I'm also dependent on the Earth. But why am I lecturing? I'm lecturing because you guys are here. So I'm dependent, in a sense, causally on you, because if none of you showed up for class today, I wouldn't be giving a lecture. But I'm also conceptually dependent on you, because again, if you ask who Van Norden is, yes, I'm the son of Charles and Helen. I'm also a teacher, but I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't have students. I'd just be a weird guy talking to himself in his office. I'll admit to being a weird guy, but I'm not just a weird guy talking to himself. I'm a weird guy who's a teacher, but I'm a teacher because I have students. So my identity as a teacher is dependent on you. But for each of the Dharma that I've described here, you could do the same thing. You are the son or daughter of parents. You are a student because I am a teacher. You are a student because more than 100 years ago, a brewer by the name of Matthew Vassar decided to endow a liberal arts college that originally was intended to give women the same liberal arts education that men could then get at Harvard and Yale. And if you're a male, you're here because I think it was 1969, Vassar went co-educational. And so all these events are part of explaining causally why you are here, but also conceptually why you are who you are. So if we drew in all the other Dharma that are relevant for understanding what and why something is, it would eventually connect to everything else in the universe. So if you want to understand who Van Norden is, you can't just refer to Van Norden, you have to refer to you. And in order to understand who you are, we can't just refer to you, we have to refer to your parents and your siblings and the government of the United States and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And ultimately, we have to go back to this guy in ancient South Asia, the Buddha, because I wouldn't be lecturing on Buddhism if it weren't for the Buddha. And of course, none of us would be here without the Big Bang. And all the matter in the universe was together in the Big Bang, so we're all connected through that. So in this sense, if you want to understand any one thing, you have to understand everything. But if you want to understand everything, there's nothing to everything. There's nothing to the all of the universe except for the parts that make it up. So all is one and one is all. And this notion that every part of the universe is connected to every other part, this is part of what Fazang is expressing in one of today's readings, the essay on the Golden Lion, where he says, all the parts, and he uses this, we'll talk about this more in a second, but he uses this metaphor of think about a golden lion statue. All that's really there is gold. So all the parts of the lion, each and every hair, by means of the gold, encompasses the whole lion completely. Each and every part is completely the eye of the lion. The eye is the ear is the nose is the tongue is the body. Why? Because they're all just the gold. So likewise, I am you. because you don't understand why I'm here or what my identity is without referring to you. But you are me, because we don't understand why you're here or what your identity is without referring to me. And not just for the two of us, but gradually it expands to encompass everything in the universe. Now, to explain this this notion of the all is one and one is all, they refer back to a famous story involving the god, originally a Hindu god who appears in the Rig Veda, one of the classic texts of the ancient Indian tradition, Indra. And the god Indra is the god of the heavens, and one, according to the Rig Veda, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful gods. And it's said that Indra had a net or a web. And there's something really special about the web or the net of Indra, which is that in the web or the net of Indra, in every place where two strands of the net come together, there's a jewel. And each jewel is so bright and so beautiful that each jewel in Indra's net reflects every other jewel in Indra's web or net. So if you look at any one jewel carefully enough, you can see every other jewel in the web. And Chinese Buddhists took this notion of Indra's net and they use a pre-existing term in Chinese philosophy, li, which we translate as pattern. In some other translations, it's sometimes rendered as a principle, which I think is not as good a translation, because li is really like a pattern. It can refer to like a pattern in a piece of wood or a pattern in a piece of jade. But Chinese Buddhist philosophers in the Huayan tradition say, imagine Indra's net and the way that every jewel in the web is reflected in every other jewel. That's a nice metaphor for the way that everything in the universe is defined in terms of other things in the universe, but also causally conditioned by ultimately everything else in the universe. And this term pattern, or in Chinese li, becomes very important from this point on in Chinese philosophy. So try to think of the universe for a second as this interconnected web of transient, causally conditioned things, each of which is dependent for its existence and its identity on other things in the universe. But because of that, if you wanted to fully understand any one aspect of existence, you need to understand everything in the universe and how it conceptually and causally determines any one part of the universe. That's the notion of Indra's web. And that's how we get from the notion of Nāgasena's chariot to the notion that one is all and all is one. Now, it's interesting because there's actually some recent scientific discoveries that give some support to the notion that everything is interconnected. You might be familiar with the butterfly effect. It turns out this is actually true. There's reason to believe that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon jungle can lead to a hurricane in Florida. Now, obviously, the flapping of the butterfly's wings by itself doesn't do it, but in conjunction with the rest of the atmosphere and the effects this small change in the atmosphere has, cascading with other kinds of effects, it can be part of the causal chain that leads to a hurricane in Florida that causes loss of light and property damage. And this is a cute cartoon showing us an evil butterfly who's very excited to be part of destroying part of Florida by flapping his wings. So part of what the butterfly effect suggests is that very small changes in one part of the world, seemingly unconnected to something else, can actually have a very big causal effect. And we don't fully understand the event over here unless we see the role of some apparently unconnected event over here. Even in physics, there's this phenomenon called quantum entanglement. And not a lot of people know this, but Einstein, although he's one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, he, of course, developed the special and general theories of relativity, and showed that space and time are relative to your inertial reference frame. But Einstein was actually very critical of quantum mechanics, which is the other great breakthrough in physics in the 20th century. And Einstein just thought quantum mechanics, which describes the behavior of very small particles, just can't be correct. And eventually he co-authored a paper. It's called the EPR paper. And the paper was designed to show that quantum mechanics has to be wrong, because quantum mechanics, Einstein and these other philosophers showed, has the implication that if two particles interact at one point in time, they are then interconnected, even if they are very far away from each other. And if you do a measurement or have an effect on the particle over here, which a long time ago interacted with the particle over here, the actions on the particle here can have a sudden effect, indeed, apparently an instantaneous effect on the particle over here. And Einstein and these other philosophers said, well, this is a reductio ad absurdum of quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics has to be false, because obviously that doesn't make any sense, that just because at a certain point two particles interacted, they can't have, the phrase Einstein used was spooky action at a distance. They can't affect each other when they're far apart much later. Then they performed decades later some experiments, and they proved that, yep, that's exactly what happens. Particles that interact are entangled, and what you do to one particle later affects another particle, even if it's far away in space. And this has massive effects for a lot of things, including quantum computing, the possibility of things like teleportation. This is all very theoretical, but still it was a real surprising result. But it shows that even things that seem to be very far apart can affect each other. So these are just a couple fun examples to suggest there might be some, additional scientific support for some of the surprising claims of Huayan Buddhism. So to give you a quick overview of how we get from Nāgasena to Nāgārjuna to Fazang, these are some lines from the essay on the Golden Lion, which we're going to look at in more detail in just a moment. One of the things that Fazang does in Essay on the Golden Lion is he gives this hierarchical ranking of different kinds of teachings. We saw that when we read Zongmi's essay on humanity last week, that he ranked different teachings and said, they're kind of in a level like this. And this is called the Panzhao method in Chinese, where you distinguish different teachings by the level of enlightenment they express. And it's very consistent with upaya, skillful means, which again, we talked about in an earlier lecture. So in terms of Buddhist teachings, Fazang says, well, at the lowest level, you've got the notion that although, and again, he's thinking about the example of a golden lion statue. He says, at one level, it's an insight to understand that although the dharma of the lion is generated and extinguished moment by moment due to cause and effect, in actuality, there is no characteristic of the lion to be found. And so this is basically the level of understanding of Nāgasena's chariot argument. So there is no chariot as a thing, independent thing in the universe. There is no Van Norden, there is no Nāgasena, there is no Melinda, there is no you as an independent thing in the universe. There are just the transient dharma, the instances of the five aggregates, the five skandhas. And the instances of physical and mental states, those are real, but there's not on top of those instances a thing that is Van Norden, or a thing that is Nāgasena, or a thing that is Van Norden's Toyota Prius, or a thing that is Vassar College. It's easiest to understand, I think, with the example of institutions, because I think we don't normally think that Vassar College is a separate thing in the universe beyond the buildings and the land and the people and the students and the teachers and administrators and ground staff and everything that makes up Vassar College. There's not a Vassar College on top of that. There's just these transient physical and mental states. It's kind of easy to accept for an institution like Vassar, but what if it's also true of people like me or people like you or people like Nāgasena? And so in ranking different teachings, Fazang says, yeah, that's a level of enlightenment when you realize, hey, there's not really a lion there. There's just gold. There's not really a separate person there. It's just a way of talking about the transient physical and mental states that are there. It's a higher level of understanding when you realize, hey, wait a second, all dharmas, since they generate due to causation, each of them lacks an individual nature, so ultimately there's only emptiness. So you apply the same argument to those dharma, those transient physical and mental states, and say, well, look, if Van Norden's not real because he's really just dependent on these transient physical and mental states, then by the same argument, there's the transient physical and mental states are not fully real, or at least they don't have independent permanent existence either, because they're dependent on other things. So it's emptiness all the way down. And this is precisely Nāgārjuna's interpretation of Buddhism. But then the higher level of understanding, the highest level, according to Fazang, is that the dharmas that are manifestations of substance become blended into one. All is one, because all are the same and lacking in individual nature. One is all, because cause and effect follow one another endlessly. So in order to understand Van Norden, you need to understand causally all of the things that lead to Van Norden causally and all the effects that Van Norden has causally. Because what is any property of me? If it's a real property, it must have an effect on something. But also conceptually, if you want to understand me, I am just the sum total of all the roles that I occupy. And so what really exists is the one, the whole, out of which all the dharmas are composed. So one is all and all is one. So that's your quick overview of how we get from the earliest form of Buddhism to Huayan Buddhism. And now I'm going to talk a bit about Fazang, and in particular, his Rafter Dialogue, which is this really fascinating work of philosophy. Now, Fazang was a Buddhist monk and nun. His family was not originally from what is now China. They were, I understand, Sogdian merchants. But he became culturally Chinese, and he became a Buddhist monk, and he became one of the greatest philosophers of the Huayan tradition. And to explain the teachings of Huayan, he gave us this Rafter Dialogue where he develops a position, and then it's a classic work of philosophy because he responds to objections to the position. And most of the objections I think you and I would think of to Fazang's position, he has a response to them in the dialogue. Now, Fazang, if these dates that he lived, this is during the Tang Dynasty in China. And in previous lectures, we've looked at Han Dynasty, China, and then the Buddhism again came to China during the Han Dynasty, like in the 1st century of the Common Era. And then after the fall of the Han Dynasty, in like the 3rd century of the Common Era, Buddhism started to really gain popularity in the ensuing period of chaos. So by the time the Tang Dynasty comes along, which is 618 to 906, by that point, Buddhism is dominant among intellectuals. It's very influential at court. And Fazang, in fact, gives lectures at the court and was actually involved in getting onto the throne Wu Zetian, who is China's one and only female empress who reigned and ruled in her own right. So Buddhism was very socially and politically influential at this point. And the Rafter Dialogue is an expression of the teachings of Huayan, which is the kind of Buddhism that Fazang is defending. So real quickly, in the Rafter Dialogue, an individual rafter is a metaphor for any individual thing or dharma, seemingly individual, of course, but a rafter is a metaphor for any seemingly individual thing, any individual dharma. The building that the rafter is a part of is a metaphor for the universe as a whole. And what Fazang is ultimately arguing is that the building is nothing beyond the sum of its parts, which seems plausible. If you ask what a building is, well, it's just a collection of parts. But he says if you want to understand the identity of any part, its identity depends on its role in constituting the building. So this metaphor is going to apply to the universe as a whole. If you want to understand any one dharma, you have to understand that it gets its significance only from its role in the whole, but what the whole of the universe is simply all the parts taken together. The whole universe is nothing beyond all those individual parts. So the Rafter Dialogue starts out with a question: what is the characteristic of wholeness? And characteristic here is, this is a Chinese term, shang, which is it's the Chinese rendering of a Sanskrit term, which I believe is lakshana. And a characteristic is kind of like a quality or a property of a thing, especially an apparent quality of the thing. And so in the Rafter Dialogue, Fazang lays out what are 6 characteristics or qualities or properties that things seem to have. And I'm going to focus on his first example, the characteristic of wholeness. So he says, one way to think about it is, if you're looking at things, there are 6 ways you could look at them. And one of the ways you could look at them is in terms of there being a whole, right? What's the characteristic of wholeness? And the answer is, well, it's the building. Well, but the building is just the various conditions, including the rafter. What is the building really? So you could look at a building and you could say, well, the building is this whole. But then if you say, well, what is this whole that is the building? It looks like it's just the conditions. In other words, the things that make the building a building, like the rafters and the roof tiles and the nails and the support beams and the main beam that the rafters are attached to. And so it looks like that the building is nothing but the parts. But then, paradoxically, Fazang says the rafter is the building. What is the reason? Because it is the rafter by itself that makes the building. Apart from the rafter, there can be no building. When there is a rafter, then there is a building. Think of the earlier diagram I showed you with the circles representing dharma and the lines representing the causal or conceptual connections between things. If you ask what Van Norden is the universe. Because to give a complete description of why I'm here and what my significance is, you have to ultimately refer to everything in the universe. Van Norden is the universe, but then you are also the universe, right? Just like the rafter is the building. Now, like I say, there's obvious questions you're going to have. Most of them you're going to find Fazang has some answer to. But first, let's just get some clarity on what a rafter is. So this diagram shows you there are different kinds of rafters, but basically on the right-hand side here, if you look at those red pieces of wood that kind of go vertically, and they attach to the ridge pole, the ridge beam, the ridge board, and then at the bottom they're supported by support beams, which are not shown here in the diagram. But those things are rafters. You can have technically different kinds of them, but basically they're the things that support the roof tiles and connect the ridge pole to the support beams at the bottom. So those here, they're in red in this particular picture. Those are classic examples of rafters. And so Fazang is saying, well, the rafter is the building. But that seems wrong. And so he's going to consider the objections that would also occur to us. Someone objects, well, wait a second, it can't be the rafter is the building. If the rafter by itself constitutes the building, then when there are no roof tiles, no nails, no support beams, no ridge poles, etc., it should still be able to make the building. So if the rafter, you imagine one of those boards is the building, then as soon as you have the rafter, you have the building. But that's not true. You don't have a building just because you have a rafter. But then the objection goes, so the rafter can't be identical with the building. But notice what Fazang says. He says, when there are no roof tiles, etc., it's not a rafter. And that is why it cannot make the building. It is not that it is a rafter, but cannot make the building. If it is a rafter, it totally forms the building. If it does not totally form the building, it's not called a rafter. This is one of the most fascinating and challenging ideas he's got. What he's claiming is what makes a piece of wood a rafter as opposed to something else is the role that it plays in the building. If the piece of wood isn't acting as a rafter, then its identity is not to be a rafter. The piece of wood has an identity as a rafter only because it's playing a certain role in a building. And again, this is a metaphor, so the idea is, if you want to understand what a thing is, the only way to understand that is in terms of the role it plays in the universe. Who is Van Norden? Van Norden is the son of Charles and Helen. Van Norden is the father of Charles and Melissa. Van Norden is the teacher of all you guys. Van Norden is the employee of Vassar College. Van Norden is a US citizen, but that only means something because of all the rest of the institutions and people and founders of the United States. One way to help clarify this a little bit, if this helps, is this is a restaurant. Look at the wall decor and look at the table. Are these chopsticks or are they restaurant decor? This is an interesting example because chopsticks are usually used once and then thrown out, so they create a lot of waste. So some people have taken to repurposing chopsticks. And you ask, well, this little piece of wood or maybe bamboo, is it a chopstick or is it a restaurant table? Is it a chopstick or is it a piece of art on the wall or a wall decoration? Whether it's a chopstick or a table or a wall decoration depends on the role that it's performing. It's not an intrinsic characteristic of the thing. Similarly, and this one, I owe this one to my example to my son, are these cell phones or a guitar? Well, they were originally cell phones, but now they've been repurposed to make the body of a guitar. So whether they're cell phones or part of the body of a guitar, they don't have an intrinsic identity. They only have an identity in terms of the role that they play. And this last example is wonderful. Are these rafters of a building or is it a conference table? This is a conference table made out of repurposed rafters from a building. So this illustrates perfectly what Fazang's talking about. If you say, well, look, the rafter can't be identical with the building because then you could have a rafter without any of the other parts and you'd have the building. But Fazang says, no, the rafter is a rafter because of the role it plays in making the building. If you took away the other parts, the rafter couldn't play that role. And so it wouldn't be a rafter anymore. It would be something else. Like what? Like part of a teeter-totter, or part of a cabinet, or firewood, or in this case, part of a conference table. So what gives a thing its identity is the role it plays in relation to other things. Things don't have an identity intrinsically, is the idea. Well, but there are other objections you might raise. And again, you might think something like this. You might say, well, what would be the error in thinking that the rafter and the other various conditions, meaning the tiles and the nails and the support beams and the main roof beam, what would be the error in thinking that these conditions each contribute a small part of the power to form the building together, rather than each entirely forming the building. And here, Fazang gives a kind of technical answer. He says, well, it would be the errors of annihilationism and eternalism. So what are annihilationism and eternalism? Remember, one of the basic teachings of Buddhism, particularly these Mahayana forms, is that everything's empty. And emptiness doesn't have a negative connotation here. It's a technical term. It just means things are empty of a permanent, independent self or identity, right? So if you say you're feeling empty, your friends will be like, oh, I'm sorry, how can I make you feel better? But emptiness is actually kind of a positive concept in a way in Buddhism, because the idea is, well, you're empty of a permanent, independent self or identity. And when you realize that you're empty in that sense, you're freed of the craving for permanence and independence, which ultimately can never be satisfied because there's nothing in the universe that has these qualities. But then they say our doctrine of emptiness has to be distinguished from two extreme positions, both of which we reject. One of them is what they call annihilationism. And annihilationism, some people might also call this metaphysical nihilism, is the view that nothing exists in any sense. So the Buddhists say, look, we're not saying that nothing exists in any sense of existence at all. We're saying that things exist, but in an empty way, lacking a permanent independent self. And of course, as Buddhists, we're also denying eternalism, which is the view that something exists that is completely permanent and independent because it lacks a cause or it lacks conceptual dependence on something else. So there's nothing which is completely permanent and independent of everything else. The doctrine that there is such a thing would be eternalism. Buddhists are denying that, but they're also not saying nothing exists in any sense. The rafter exists in a sense, but its existence depends on the existence of the barn or the building. The building exists, but its existence depends on the existence of the component parts of which it's made up. It's just eternal, independent existence that they're denying. So metaphysically, Buddhism likes to describe itself as a middle way between annihilationism and eternalism, since it acknowledges the conditional existence of phenomena, yet denies uncaused, independent, or eternal entities. Buddhism is also described as a middle way because of its attitudes towards desires. Because Buddhism says, look, we're not rejecting all desire. We're not saying you should sit there like a rock and just, starve to death, cease to exist. But we're also not endorsing the unrestrained satisfaction of your desires. We're advocating a moderate satisfaction of your desires based on the understanding that you are not permanent, the things you're craving are not permanent, and they think this leads to a healthy kind of motivation, a healthy kind of desire, which is different from both asceticism, but also different from complete indulgence of all your desire. So we'll get to part 3 about Essay on the Golden Lion next time, and then we'll go on to talk about the Platform Sutra of the 6th patriarch of the Chan or Zen tradition. But for now, I want to try to hopefully finish the Rafter Dialogue. So so you want to avoid both annihilationism and eternalism, Fazang says. But then another objection you might have to his view that the rafter is the building is, well, look, without one rafter, isn't it still a building? And this seems very intuitive, right? I mean, we all know buildings. I mean, I've owned houses. Houses are always, the thing about houses is they're always falling apart. So you're always replacing rafters and shingles and things. So look, are you saying that without one rafter, isn't it still a building? And his answer is, it's just a ruined building, not a functional building. This is how we know the functional building entirely depends on the rafter. Because it entirely depends on the rafter, we know the rafter is the building. Now, this might seem a little unintuitive, a little surprising, because you say, well, okay, you're showing me a picture of a ruined building, but Van Norden, a building isn't in fact destroyed just because it's missing one rafter. But here's how I think about it. Again, ask yourself, what is a building? Is there anything to a building other than the parts that make it up? It seems like no, a building is just the parts that make it up. But if that's true, if a building is just the parts that make it up, then you take away one part, that building is now gone. If the building was identical with its parts, then you take one part away, it's no longer the same building. And if you want to say, well, but no, it is the same building, even if you take one part away. That's the kind of thing an Aristotelian might say, that no, the building has an identity independent of any one individual part. But if you try to think about what that is, what's the identity of the building independent of its parts, it's really hard to know what it is. Is it like there's a ghostly building soul that's kind of sitting there and, you know, the building soul remains even if you take the parts away? That's crazy, right? But if the building is the parts, then if you take one part away, it's not the same building. How am I doing on time? We'll talk about that some more next time, but just to finish the Rafter dialogue, another objection that he considers is, well, since the building is the rafter, then the planks, roof tiles, etc., should also be the rafter. So again, this is supposed to be a reductio ad absurdum of Fazang's position. He's imagining an objector who says, look, the rafter isn't the building. Because if this argument worked, that the rafter is the building, then by the same argument, the planks, the roof tiles, the shingles, the nails, the support beam, those must also be the building, and therefore they must also be the rafter. Huh? And Fazang says, they all are the rafter. Why? Because without the rafter, there is no building. If there is no rafter, the building is wrecked. Since the building is wrecked, they are not called planks, roof tiles, etc. This is why the planks, roof tiles, etc. are the rafter. If they were not the rafter, the building could not be constructed. The rafter, tiles, etc. could not exist. Now, since they all exist, we know their characteristics are identical. They are identical with the rafter, and this applies to the other conditions as well in similar fashion. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. Okay, so in other words, an analogy would be saying, well, look, if you want to say that Van Norden is his students, because Van Norden wouldn't be a professor without his students, well, then I guess the students are also Van Norden, right? Because they wouldn't be students without Van Norden. And Fazang says, yep, exactly right. Their identity depends on Van Norden too. It's reciprocal. So one way of thinking about it is if you say, what is there to our universe other than the sum total of everything that exists in the universe, all the dharma that make up the universe? It seems like, well, there's nothing to the universe besides all the little dharma that make up the universe. But if that's correct, then if you plucked a single thing out of the universe, it wouldn't be the same universe anymore. It wouldn't have the same identity. So if the least important soldier in the army of Alexander the Great ceased to exist, somehow got pulled out of the timeline, the entire universe would collapse, because everything in the universe depends on its connections to everything else. And it starts to seem, when you look at it really carefully, that it's not just a metaphor, but a statement of a brute fact about the universe, that everything in the universe is dependent on everything else in the universe, just like the jewels in Lord Indra's web. So this is as far as we're going to get in today's lecture. We'll finish up next lecture talking about the essay on the Golden Lion, and then we'll go on to talk about the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, which is one of the seminal statements of the metaphysics of Chan or Zen Buddhism, and that is in turn is very, very much influenced by Huayan Buddhism. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.